I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. As Sokuzan often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices. Good evening. Thank you for joining Basic Buddhist Teachings this evening. Tonight, I'm going to start a short series of talks that will take us up until our month-long Anglo retreat in February, talking about the four reminders. And so this evening, I'm going to be talking about the first reminder, which is often, in its simplest form, talks about the precious human birth. But this teaching, the four reminders, sometimes called the four thoughts, is very common in Tibetan Buddhism. I believe it's incorporated in the Nundro practice. And I've seen where it's been attributed to Padmasambhava. And it's a way for us to contemplate a number of things. It's a reminder of the Dharma. It brings our attention, the four dharmas that return the mind to the Dharma. And it's a lot of times used as an inspirational practice, but also around death and dying. This is a practice that is incorporated heavily for those actively working with death and dying. But it's also a practice that Sokuzan has given to a number of his students to just see if they can't recite that first thing in the morning. I know that's something he did for years. He would recite these four reminders before getting out of bed, I believe even before opening your eyes. So the idea was that was the first thought in the day. And so the first reminder of the precious human birth, and there's many ways of translating or writing this out, the way in which we work with it, which I believe comes from Trungpa Rinpoche, goes first, contemplate the preciousness of being free and well-favored. Difficult to gain, easy to lose. Now I must do something meaningful. And there's a traditional image in Buddhism of the precious human birth I really like it, and I think it's because I like turtles a lot. I'm really fond of turtles. And so the image is, if the entire earth were one great big ocean, no land anywhere, and there was one turtle in this great big ocean of a world, and there was a ring in this ocean. I think of like a life buoy, a life ring you see at the end of piers or on boats, and it's just floating around in the ocean. And this turtle is going to come to the surface once every 100 years, once every 1,000 years, once every kalpa. The likelihood of having a precious human birth is the likelihood of that turtle popping up through the ring. I really like that image. The way that might make resonate more deeply is that we have no idea how we were born, and we have no idea if anything will come after death, or if there's any sense of life or rebirth after death. Of course, traditionally, theoretically, there's a lot of information in that area. There's been a lot of people looking into rebirth, but we don't know. So here we have this one opportunity, a precious human birth. And the idea of being free and well-favored, the well-favored does not mean that our karma is easy. It does not mean that the causes and conditions arising for each of us individually are not overwhelming, painful. It's that for some reason, we have curiosity to look closer at these causes and conditions, at least close enough to consider that we might not have to just live at the whims or the impulses of dependent origination. So we first contemplate the preciousness of being free and well-favored. We don't know how we got here. We don't know if we will ever get here again. Difficult to gain, easy to lose. Now I must do something meaningful. So the encouragement is, and in our tradition, it would be, the meaningful part would be to practice the Dharma. The Dharma is something that helps us understand or clarify these profound causes and conditions that have come together to create the appearance of an identity in a world where the teachings are available, the teachings are alive, and we can investigate that closely. And so you could imagine, if you worked with a practice like this, just this first reminder, how you might start your day. and how if we could actually consider how precious this opportunity is, how it might change the way we live our lives. And the next 4 reminders, which we will go into more over the next 3 weeks or 2 weeks after tonight. The second one is impermanence. The third one is karma. And the fourth one is suffering. So not only to appreciate the precious human birth, but to see how transient it is, that death comes without warning, to see that there are causes and conditions that we tend to fuel, and that the result is suffering, may inspire us to navigate our day in such a way where it's not, I'll save it for later. So it's what is it that I can do to relate to what is in front of me more directly? How can I return to my vow? How can I acknowledge my vow? That the precious human birth for a bodhisattva or an aspiring bodhisattva is, how do I orient my life? How do I orient body, speech, and mind towards seeing the truth for the benefit of others? And so you can see where this practice would first maybe show up as an aspirational practice, a preliminary practice, perhaps included in the preliminary Tibetan stages. But you could also see why it would be so heavily tied into death and dying. It really acknowledges how quickly and unexpectedly death can come, and that at the time of death, it says that you will be helpless. You will be helpless at the time of death. At the time of death is not the time to try to all of a sudden, well, I want to train my mind now. Some of that, there are practices around that, but now is our opportunity to work with that. Something about that phrasing, though, precious human birth, I think can be deceptive too, because as I said, it's not a preciousness in the sense of we had a wonderful birth or we had a wonderful childhood, or that the causes and conditions that surround us are easy. But again, precious in the opportunity to learn to receive, to practice receiving. We have forms that facilitate that. We have a teacher, we have a teaching, we have a sangha. And reflecting on this first reminder, even conceptually, may help us reframe the way in which we approach our world. That if this is a precious human birth, there isn't anything that's not a precious human birth. No matter how outlandish, no matter how heartbreaking, no matter how disturbing it is. And so as we function throughout our day to just flash on, to consider, not maintain, but the precious human birth, the precious birth of all compounded phenomena, unreal, transparent, ephemeral, but it's showing up. So as SokukoJi says, we don't reject it, we don't accept it, we don't look away. But in considering the precious human birth, we may look at it more closely. We don't just see it for what we think it is and move on. We might consider, what is that? What is it to be precious? What is it to be a precious birth? Free, well-favored, difficult to gain, easy to lose. And how do I do something meaningful? The meaning is always directly in front of us. The preciousness is always directly in front of us. Whatever is arising, no matter how contrary it is to our ideas, is the meaning. And SokukoJi, I feel like, was talking about that tonight during As It Is with Yudao's question, that the question is the answer. Question is the answer. That what is arising is the precious birth. It is what is meaningful. It is what we do that is do something meaningful. Give what is showing up your attention. If you're looking for a good translation of that too, we can send you a copy. And I believe I found it on the Nalanda Translation Committee. I believe was started by Trungpa Rinpoche. And online, it's, as far as I can tell, word for word, the same 4 reminders that SokukoJi has us study as well. So they're everywhere. Everyone's commented on the 4 reminders. There's countless materials to investigate that. And I have no doubt if you go onto YouTube, you can also find talks that SokukoJi has given on these 4 reminders to return our attention to the Dharma. Does anybody have questions about the first reminder of a precious human birth?
And this first reminder doesn't strike me as something terribly Buddhist. It seems like very applicable anybody is there? What is there to do? What is there to do? Is there anything to do if one is not a practitioner?
I feel the way in which that ties into the practice specifically is in the form of training the mind. That free and well favored is not as simple as just being able to have a physical body. There are people that are enslaved and tortured in a physical body. And to me, again, that free and well favored is that there's enough, as SokukoJi said, there's enough curiosity to ask what this is. And then at the end, to do something meaningful. Again, that could be interpreted in countless ways, but the dharma, to me, interpretation would be to practice the dharma. What I also like about what you said, though, is that you said it seems very applicable. And I feel like the Buddhist teachings should be. I feel that we don't want them to tumble into relativism, but in its essence, there's nobody that these teachings don't apply to. Now, that's not to say they should be practicing them, but I think the Buddha was a radical in that sense, in that he intended or endeavored to make these teachings as accessible as possible. In his time, what he was coming up against were things like the caste system, as well as, and even he had resistance to bringing women into monasticism. But I think that these teachings are very much available and applicable without having to have a special background. But it's a matter of, are you curious? Does this resonate in such a way where you want to look closer? And not everybody wants to, and probably not everybody should.
In Vine, you speak of that doing something meaningful as training the mind. When I hear that first reminder, what comes up to me first over and over again is some sense of putting others first or serving others. Is there a tie in that first reminder? Where does that relate?
I think that to me it also resonates very strongly that the meaningfulness is training one's mind is not isolated from serving others. That there's a strong intention connected to seeing clearly that it is to be a benefit to others or not cause so much pain for others. And that's perhaps where we see that delineation between the Pratyeka Buddha and the Bodhisattva. And I don't think we need to be disparaging of the Pratyeka. I would love to have a self-stylized realization of any sort. But the Bodhisattva's intention is a little bit different. It's not an isolated realization. So I think that in reflecting on these 4 reminders, again, if you recognize the preciousness of this, the impermanence of this, the karma, the suffering, for some, there's no guarantees. It may begin to soften the way we relate to others. Less demand. We actually see how complicated and how difficult it is to be a human being. And so there may be a sense of at least giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, if not a little warmth towards the suffering of others. Chiezan.
You said the meaning is always right in front of us. How does that look to you?
I don't know. The way I understand that is that we're not looking for something that has a locality other than where we're at. That it's not an obscured meaning. It is the very question. It's not its own answer intellectually. It's not that the question is the answer in the sense of logically or conceptually. It is the very fact that it is compounded phenomena. It is an invitation directly into dependent origination, that you don't have to have a resolution from the apparent misunderstanding that the question comes out of. And so I think that's where the immediacy shows up, that it's not something that I can follow logically or understand necessarily, but it brings my attention back to precisely how something is arising is how I need to receive it. And any impulse to modify abandons the generosity of what is showing up. Oh no.
Hold on, you just said how it's showing up. matters. How is that?
The form, the texture, not how conceptually, but again, when we sit down to meditate, if we were to take an emotion for an example, those seem to be the most antagonistic or seductive to do something with. That the very form that shows up in, if it's anger, it does not need where it came from. It doesn't need a justification. It doesn't need a resolution, but it is, I think sometimes this is where we might talk about Rangjung, or it's self-existing. It is complete. That doesn't work if we're looking for it to make sense conceptually. And so I just come back to Sokuzan saying that you don't have to get rid of anything. Or when we hear in the teachings, everything is preaching the dharma. I still like how Sokuzan said it, everything is screaming at you, not separate. That can't be the case if it needs to be modified. But it's the prejudice, the projection, the lamination that obscures that, you could say. But even that isn't an obscuration of seeing clearly. Even the projection doesn't have to go away.
What about, I was, when you said how, I was just hearing some juxtaposition between the form and the content.
Could you say more? I probably misspoke.
No, I think that's just where I was going, where it was,
No, I misspoke.
and so when you're saying to look at how it shows up, for example, with the anger, I guess, I don't know what the content would be other than the story of anger. But for example, with a thought that arises, it seems like the words could be one thing, the content, and the fact that the form, the thought is arising could be something else. And I guess my question is, do both matter?
They both completely matter, but they don't connect. They don't align. They don't resolve. And so what I'm trying to say is that anything that you can describe, that's always appropriate, but there's still some impulse to have resolution. There's still some impulse of modifying or creating or pacifying, that there's some activity that if we could just do that activity, then it would be realization. And I don't know this, but I feel, the way I understand, the way this is talked about, the way I've been receiving this from Sokuzan for as long as I have, not to be disrespectful, but it's so much more simple. It's so much more simple, not that the imagery or the feelings aren't very complex or very frightening or terrifying, but those are self-arisen. You have no say-so in those showing up. So you could say, in a sense, why should you have any say-so in modifying them? So the practice of meditation can begin to be a practice of ease, in the sense of, you see, you don't have to do anything. That dependent origination is not going to particularly stop in its relative form. Sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, thoughts are going to continue to arise. But just as they arose without your say-so, they don't need your permission to sustain. They don't need your permission to resolve, to fall apart. And in that sense, it becomes a very soft practice of just, as we're returned to over and over, just receive, just observe, just receive. And in its simplest form, that's the instruction Sokuzan gives. It's a very simple instruction, but we make it very complicated. And so therefore, the instructions match that by becoming a little more complicated, to help give us a little more sense of reminding us in more elaborate ways that just receive. There's nothing to be done with what is arising.
I'm also hearing now like a differentiation between observing and receiving what's arising, so that you can do observation or make observation more active than what you're suggesting right now, or what you're pointing at.
I think those two words are pretty interchangeable. Now, if I wanted to go into them intellectually, we could make any story to differentiate them, and we could make up a story to resolve them and say they're the same thing. In to me, this is where the personal quality comes in, is what is it that's going to get you back to the cushion to continue to look? I don't feel too hung up on the particular phrase. It's not to say you can say anything, but I feel that when we sit down to meditate, observe or receive is the starting point, but what we actually are doing, we can't really define. And Sokuzan said something along those lines of you can't even see the part of consciousness that's being trained. And that was a relief to me. That was something about that was very relieving. Even more so, there's less to do, but to show up, to intend to see. Thank you.
If doing something meaningful is training the mind, what is everything else?
I feel that once you start to train the mind, everything is training the mind, but we need those containers to start to understand what that means. We can't just immediately jump into the deep end and say, well, everything's training the mind, everything is the teacher. No, we need a living embodiment, and we need strong forms. But there's no area where you aren't training the mind. I think that becomes very apparent, particularly at the monastery. For me, at least, and perhaps for others, that you see even outside of the more formal practices, there's still a lot happening that's tied into the heart of this mandala. Even Shoto have been working on the bathroom at Mountain Peak for like 2 weeks now. I don't know what your experience of that is, but does it feel like completely isolated from the monastery or the whole mandala of training the mind?
SokukoJi, I'm not sure if I can formulate my question or what I want to know. Is the curiosity that we have about what this is more than intellectual or conceptual?
I feel that it is. I can't say for everybody. It's hard to continue for as long as many of us have continued, or to return as often as we do on a weekly basis if it weren't more than intellectual, because most of us are not getting satiated in that sense after 10 years, 11 years, 12, I don't know, been studying with Sokuzan for a long time. So there's something that seems probably more than conceptual in that curiosity. If it was just conceptual, it'd be easier to, by now you'd have a PhD, you'd have done your 4 years of undergraduate and then maybe 4 years of graduate and then some postdoctorate work and good to go.
SokukoJi, are you able to say what that non-conceptual curiosity is? Is there another word besides curiosity for it?
What immediately flashed for me would be heart connection. Sokuzan and I were talking this morning, and I forget what you asked me. But my response was something along the lines of, I wouldn't still be here if it weren't for X. It was something, and it's like, if you were just going on the most basic, relative, traditional expectations and norms, this doesn't really make sense. You're hearing somebody say, you might not even have this in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. You may never have anything. And for some reason you don't go, well, I think I'll go spend my time doing something else. So to me, maybe it's a stretch from curiosity, but there's something that is connecting a lot of us on a level that's much deeper than we can simply explain to family or friends, and most of us don't even try. So we might call it a heart connection. Our relationship's another example of that.
Say more.
Like you said to Isu, we've been trying to get away from each other for a while. Yeah. Shoka, I put this screw in his drink tonight. It was in the radiator. And when I went to start my talk, I see that he had snuck it into the cushions up here. Super.
So Grim bowing, for someone who makes the simple practice complicated, what would be your instruction bowing?
Well, my instruction to you would be talk to your teacher. There's a heart connection there for sure. But the simplicity is not other than the complication you're talking about. It really is not. The complication is just dependently arisen. It's not contrary or at odds with the simplicity of the practice. The simplicity of the practice is seeing that that complication has every right to be there, and you're not the one that gives it permission to be there. So when you see you're not giving it permission to be there, nor are you the one to modify it, that's the simplicity. The content is absolutely complicated and outrageous and heartbreaking and everything else. We begin to see the simplicity when we see that it is not personal. It's dependently arisen. That doesn't just show up intellectually. That's why we just continue to return. We continue to utilize a form like Dokusan, utilize a form like box sitting.
So Grim bowing, do you have insight into a understanding where thoughts are not identified with bowing?
I needed a little
Yeah.
differently, sorry.
Yeah. I'll think about it. Thank you.
Yuhong bowing.
Yes.
The curiosity you just mentioned, can it be strengthened or deepened by the repetition of returning bowing?
I think so. I think very much so that as we return, you could say those walls of the mind become more transparent, or our projections become more apparent. And so in that sense, I feel that the curiosity can take on a new form as we continue to return, because we start to wear out the habituation. We stop necessarily buying into the impulsive thinking or the impulsive action, perhaps not in its entirety, but long enough to ask ourselves, what is that? So yes, I think that's a wonderful question. And I feel that my experience has been along those lines of the returning to the teacher has helped me understand that relationship better. Returning to the cushion has helped me understand that better, and in a way that I'm more curious about it and perhaps less certain of what it is.
Thank you, bowing.
Thank you. Jishin.
Jishin bowing. Is that heart connection you are talking about in the case of the teacher? Is it the connection to the teacher or to what the teacher represents for us? Bowing.
Probably a little bit of both. And I think initially it may take on more of the form of the teacher as a person, but also as a representation or an embodiment, not just a representation, but an embodiment of the lineage itself. And so in that sense, it goes far beyond the teacher, but you don't abandon the teacher either. You don't just. Sokuzan said the other day, when asked if he idealizes Trungpa and Koben, and his answer was immediate and definite. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So you still see there's still some connection that's pretty strong for him that's related to those two forms, and yet it's also not confined by those forms in the sense that it's not lost at the passing of those bodies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chiezan, how do you understand the contemplate in the first reminder?
I'm going to put it into, again, a traditional context and then see if I can't respond more deeply. If we're looking at Buddhist, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, there's 3 stages of thinking, contemplating, and meditating. And so the first thing is we hear the teachings and we do consider them, and we're pretty analytical sometimes, and we look at them and we turn them around and we ask questions about them, and then we sit down and meditate without necessarily setting up an expectation. So contemplation is a more active practice where you actually can go through and consider what those words mean and what they mean to you and how they may or may not resonate. So I think contemplation is not something Sokuzan overly emphasizes, but it's also something I've heard him talk about on a few occasions. Sometimes he'll say if you're going to sit for 4 hours, maybe you could spend 10 minutes, the note card method, where he'll say write something down on a note card, spend 5 or 10 minutes thinking about it, contemplating it, and then just sit for the next 3 hours and 50 minutes. So this practice can be done as a contemplation where you word by word break it down, and it can be done quicker as you get more familiar where you just recite it or repeat it. Shinshu.
Into bowing. How is this first reminder different from like a gratitude practice of just listing things or thinking of things that you're grateful for? Bowing.
Well, it's certainly not listing things you're grateful for necessarily, but I'm also would say that there may be a quality of gratitude in that. It would be individual. Other people may find it just abrasive or condescending or too fluffy or too whatever. So this isn't a practice that necessarily is universally going to be something everyone wants to do. But I would say that there can be a quality of in acknowledging these things, particularly the precious human birth and the impermanence of it, which is a second reminder that you might have some appreciation. And that's a word that I like a little bit better, to appreciate it. The other thing would be that oftentimes a more traditional expression of gratitude or appreciation is a cover-up. It's like, stop thinking about the bad things and just be grateful for what you have. Just appreciate what you have. And so the totality of these 4 reminders starts out with that positive, precious human birth, but then it says, oh, and impermanence and karma and suffering. And so it's more about going into the material deeply as opposed to pacifying one's own experience. I think it can open up the experience more than soften it.
Yuhong bowing.
Yes.
How can we understand and see the limitation of words, the words of teaching? Bowing.
One of the ways is by recitation, because as you recite something over and over and over again, it really begins to, it starts to come apart because the words start to become sounds. And that's really interesting. I don't know, I did this as a child, and maybe, I don't know if you did or if your kids do this, but you say the same word over and 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 over, and it stops being a word at all. It's just this sound. Did anybody else do that as a kid? Just me. I just thought that was really fascinating, how you could make words not be words anymore.
I have a word that I invented that I taught to one of my friends, and then it was like a secret code word, and it was dharma reldo always a wish of real.
Can you spell that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. And he remembered it too. He pronounced it slightly different, but I thought he should get the privilege to pronounce it different. And it started out with his first name, Don. Want to hear it again?
Yeah.
I'm not going to.
Well, we got it recorded. But that's another way to work with these practices is that, Sokuzan sets it up this way. He says sometimes go very slow, consider each word, and other times zip right through it, just say it very quickly over and over and over again. In both ways can be helpful because it can be helpful to contemplate. And again, you can't say this is going to help for everybody. It can't be set up in that way, but for some people, that recitation over and over again, where the conceptual meaning drops away, you may have more of an intuitive experience of it. That's not ultimate truth. It's not an advantage. It's just another way for us to approach this or look at this.
玉红报应
Go ahead, you.
I think the reason I asked a question because I started to notice more and more every time when I speak, I feel like I started to have the could be fear or awareness of taking positions by saying the words. However, as a human being, as also my profession, I cannot not talking that much when I in the classroom. So just every day when I speak, I feel like that fear, I started to notice more and more of taking sides by reinforcing the words that I use. Is that should I be concerned about that, or I just need to observe my fear and that? Bowing.
I feel that just the very fact that you're asking about it, you're considering it, you're looking at it, that's probably enough. And as you continue to look at it, you may be surprised at how it changes. I've been lucky enough, again, the feedback I've gotten mostly around my talks is about maybe, as you've heard how I pronounce words, but also words that I may repeat a lot. And occasionally getting the feedback of, why don't you see if there's a few other words you could use in place of that? And that's been helpful. Maybe in a way I can't quite say, but it starts with just being aware of how you're communicating and not necessarily trying to change it because you want it to be more in line with how you think it should be. So I would say, yes, just continuing to look at it.
Thank you, Bowing.
When you're bowing, is contemplation a search for meaning? Bowing?
I don't think it has to be, but it may evolve. It may lead you into another area where you're considering this, and then it may lead to another area where you're considering that. I think if we were to look at contemplation as another intention, the intention is perhaps to go into it a little bit deeper, to look at it in a more conceptual realm. But I don't think it has to hinge on meaning, because you could contemplate the four reminders for the rest of your life, and that would be enough. It wouldn't be about, now I have the ultimate meaning of the four reminders. And I think that's how we work with study here as well, is that it's a continual contemplation without the expectation of a result. But there is more of an active quality in contemplation as opposed to, you could say, just the receiving of meditation.
When you're bowing, I'm kind of stuck on that word meaning. Does it have any meaning?
The contemplation?
No, the word meaning, is it important?
Relatively. I think relatively, again, if we're using any language to help us look more closely, but the meaning is not necessarily going to solidify as something new or different, but we want to see what this is. And you could say in that sense, what is this all about? What does this mean? Not a phrase we would use necessarily here. So I wouldn't get rid of the word meaning, but look at the way in which are we trying to use that to abandon what is arising, to cover up, to look for something else, or are we using it to help facilitate us to just look very deeply at the very thing that's showing up?
one other thing, when you're bowing, and I didn't catch the whole phrase, but you, said something to the effect that we don't have to be at the whims of dependent origination.
Yes.
What is that? What is being at the whim? What do you mean by, what do you mean by that?
That when something arises, we don't have to buy into the impulse to do something about it, that the content continues to arise, the emotions, the stories continue to arise. But after anger arises, not being at the whims of that anger is to see that you neither have to lash out of that anger, you don't have to cover up that anger, that you really don't have to do anything with it. So I think what's really hard for me, or has been hard for me, is thinking that I have to feel like doing the thing I need to do before I can actually do it. That somehow, in order for it to be sincere or genuine, the feeling has to accompany it, that it's right, or it's good, or I like it. And that is really hard for an aspiring bodhisattva, to see that your feelings don't indicate how you should relate to the situation. It's much more difficult than that. Isaac,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Isaac.
Isaac Bowing, what does indicate how you should relate to a situation, Bowing?
I don't know that it's something we can identify. The closest I've heard or would consider that Sokuzan's talk about is the situation itself. The situation lets you know what it needs, but it's not being communicated as thoughts and emotions. And so we come back to that idea of not knowing, that perhaps relatively not knowing is the closest ego can come to knowing what to do, to seeing what's appropriate, because you've not filled the space up yet. So I don't know if that's helpful to consider how the situation is telling you precisely what it needs.
Yuhong Baoyin, still maybe a second part of the question that I asked. As a student, how can you suggest me to study the text? Because of when I read, I feel like I simply taking the words in by without giving a doubt. Is that when the teacher Sokuzan said giving a doubt, don't believe me? What does that mean? Does that apply to learning the text, learning this? Fine.
I think the benefit of the doubt is encouraging us not to take an immediate position, but to consider what is arising. Consider it, no matter how seductive it is, you don't have to step right into it. No matter how repulsive it is, you don't have to run away from it. So giving something the benefit of the doubt is that curiosity or the consideration. The most apparent way to work with that would be, again, studying with a group. But when you're looking at material by yourself, you could take your time and maybe take some notes, especially if it's dharma material that you may want to ask Sokuzan about, and see what are the areas that seem very apparent, what seems very contrary, and are there things I could do to look at that more closely.
Yuhong Baoyin, I don't know whether it's a concern, sorry for the personal question regarding learning the text. So when I read certain text, it's really stuck with me, very strong, shown up very strongly, which is very inspiring for me. However, I do also feel a little bit concerned whether I simply believe what I read. So that's the reason why I asked the question, how I can be aware of not simply believe in what I'm reading, even though this is something that I'm so passionate about.
Can I ask what the text is?
Yes, it's actually the Muzuku's the text is the sorry, I have to make sure that I say the right thing. The title, you're in the email too, sorry. I just cannot remember the title. Yes, the title of the book, yes.
Yeah, one way you could do that is you could read it 100 times And when you get to that, read it 500 times, you could see how that affects the intellectual and emotional qualities around it. I think there's a collection of 13 talks from Sokuzan on Hokkyo-zanmai that he gave when I first met him in 2011, perhaps. I think it was the session when they were over New Year's. I came for some of those talks, so that'd be another way to do it is go into that material, go back into some of the talks on Hokkyo-zanmai. But I think reciting it a lot might bring some different awareness into it.
Thank you, Bowing.
It would be neat if that Hokkyo-zanmai was written by Dongshan Lianji. It would be really neat to hear that in Mandarin sometime. If you ever recorded it, I would love to hear how it sounds.
Here.
Yeah.
Love to hear it.
Go ahead, Jishin.
Jishin Bowing. What is that which communicates what is needed in the situation? Bowing.
It's not confined to locality. It is not a source. It is dependent origination itself, you could say. So it's not a special thing. I like when Sokuzan says the dharma is mutual, like the teachings are mutual, that has to co-arise with a teacher and a student, a question and a response. And so similarly, you don't have a teacher hoarding the dharma, and you don't have a student that they have to come together, it seems, for the dharma to be expressed in a relative sense. And I think similarly with the situation, you can't find the part that you would call a situation that's saying what it needs, but it's actually the totality. It is dependent origination.
Jishin Bowing. So what is in us which can receive or understand it, if not thoughts or emotions? Bowing.
Very good question. And again, I'm not meaning to dismiss that, but it doesn't matter. You do not need to locate that. You do not need to dissect and find that. It is, to me, it is so much more intimate. And that's what the practice is encouraging us or inviting us to do, is to just come into that space. Initially, that space is the Zendo, virtually or in person. That is the space you share with your teacher physically or virtually. You don't have to go looking for something beyond that, but we can continue to come to that with an idea of what is this? What is this? What is this? We can close. We'll stand and dedicate a minute. As Sokuzan often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating, up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So if anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices.